What I want to do today is to try to explain how our sense of loss of history, what I call historical amnesia, which pervades Western societies, is inextricably linked to many of the problems that we have in relation to standing up for freedom, and why freedom has increasingly become a rhetorical accomplishment rather than something that we actually live. And in particular, I want to end on by explaining how the key issue of our time in relation to freedom is the freedom of conscience, which both sides of the cultural wars actually regard in a very selective and slightly instrumental kind of way, rather than as being something we fervently believe in. I think the reason why history is important in relation to this discussion is because unless you understand the past, unless you understand how freedoms have been won and accomplished, unless you understand the opposite of freedom in all of its different forms, it becomes very difficult to know the stage that we're passing through. And a lot of people seem to imagine that many of the issues and the problems that we have today almost emerge from nowhere, from the sky. And we have a language that continually emphasizes the distinction between the present and the past. We talk about the new normal. We talk about the end of ideology. We talk about the end of history. We talk about the end of the nation state. We talk about the end of sovereignty. And if you look at this obsession with endism, it's become a veritable ideology, to the point at which no sooner is the pandemic coming to an end than people are talking about the new normal, as if the old normal is something we can casually leave behind. And no sooner does the war in the Ukraine break out than people talk about the new reset, how Ukraine is going to reset geopolitics. And it really reminds me, this sense of historical amnesia, of an experience that I had in a debate that I was involved in New York. And that was about international relations and about conflicts. And one of the arguments that became very prominent in the sphere of international relations almost became a kind of a received wisdom, is that we now live in the world where wars have become obsolete. We now live in a world where wars have become dysfunctional, certainly in Europe. And if you recall, one of the main arguments that was used by the Remainer lobby in relation to Brexit was, as long as you have the European Union, peace will prevail in Europe. That's what like the guarantee that peace and stability will prevail in the European continent. And that kind of magical thinking, which was very strong within the sphere of international relations, led a lot of people to suggest that wars, in the way that they were conducted, were so 19th century. And the number of times we've been told, it's interesting that even in the discussions on the Ukraine, you occasionally hear people talk about how this war, how Russia's invasion of Ukraine is so 19th century. As if somehow these kinds of conflicts belong to the ancient past, and we now live in a different world, where we no longer expect these kinds of conflicts to continue. Maybe they occur in Syria, now and again in Libya, maybe in a far distant place, but in our European continent, this doesn't exist. And the same people that talked about the irrelevance of wars in Europe also talked about the irrelevance of borders. There's an end of border movement, sort of a world without borders. And of course, you need to tell the Ukrainian people about this, that borders don't matter, and the fight they're waging to defend their borders is not something out of Disneyland, but actually something very, very real. So the question that I'm kind of grappling with is, why is it that we have forgotten so much about the world that is relevant to our day-to-day lives? Why is it that the West was caught unaware in relation to the conflict within Ukraine? And why is it that suddenly people talk about the return of history when all along history was there? History didn't go to sleep. History didn't go into hibernation. The cultural and political elites of the West were the ones that fell asleep. And they really did find it very difficult, and even today, they find it very, very difficult to wake up from this very long historical slumber that afflicted them. In 1938, Winston Churchill published a little book called Arms and Covenant, which was later in that year republished in America under the title While England Slept. I love that title, While England Slept. And what Churchill was referring to, of course, was the tendency towards appeasement within British society, where people tried to ignore the fact that Hitler was rearming, that Germany was going to invade Europe, and war was inevitable. That was the basic argument. And Churchill was extremely angry and really kind of worried about the fact that England was sleeping while the world was essentially moving on. Now, if Churchill was alive today, his version of While England Slept would be retitled, I would argue, While the West Went into Hibernation. And what mattered in 1938 was to rearm militarily. That's what he was really trying to promote. Today, in our world, what really matters, above all, is to rearm morally. And when I mean morally, I don't mean moralistically, but by morally I mean essentially to become aware of the values and the traditions that are associated with the kind of cultural accomplishment of the kind of civilizational developments that occurred first in Greece, then kicked in Rome, moved on in the Renaissance, and eventually came to fruition during the Enlightenment. And it seems to me that if you lose the values that were integral to this, what you end up is our presentist, historical amnesia form of civilization. So for me, the question of moral rearmament is inextricably linked to the issue of freedom, because freedom doesn't come from nowhere. Freedom is based upon a moral foundation, and is not just simply a political accomplishment, but is also a moral accomplishment. To be genuinely committed to freedom, you got to understand this, and this is something that is lost in today's discussion, that is that freedom is something that is good in and of itself. It's not what freedom does. It's not the aim of freedom. Freedom is something that is good in and of itself. And that's something that we can only understand and practice once we understand its historical foundation. In effect, the West has morally disarmed itself to the point that it now needs to harness the heroism of the people of Ukraine for the self-serving project of revitalizing itself. And if you can see, and if you ever watch this, what I would call Zelensky enemy, where every prime minister and president wants to be photographed next to Zelensky, where you have this celebrities kind of coming to Kiev to take a picture to show that they too were here, and almost imply that this is going to save our world. Even Francis Fukuyama, who Alistair mentioned, talk about the end of history. Even Fukuyama has argued that the struggle in Ukraine is going to provide us with moral clarity. I mean, what a statement. Right? What a statement that somehow our moral illiteracy in our culture is not something that we can solve for ourselves. It's not our duty to confront that kind of problem. The moral clarity, whereby you have the evil on one side, the evil of Russia on one side, and the angels of Ukraine on the other side, where good and evil kind of fight it out, is what Western needs in order to become morally clear. And of course, Ukrainians deserve much more than that, because they're not fighting for their lives to make Western politicians feel good about themselves. They're actually fighting for their freedom. Just by the by, Boris Johnson should have read Churchill's While England Slept, because he certainly has become afflicted with a bout of historical amnesia. You will have heard him say this week that Vladimir Putin was the personification of toxic masculinity. And every time I hear the word toxic masculinity, I feel like reaching for my metaphorical masculine weapon. And he basically claimed that Russia would not have invaded Ukraine if he was a woman. Obviously, he's buying into the cultural norms of capital culture in an indirect way. He said, if Putin were a woman, which he obviously isn't, so he's quite observant, but if he were, I really don't think he would have embarked on a crazy macho war of invasion or violence in the way that he has. And you kind of wonder whether, what the Russian Empress, Catherine the Great, who actually did invade the Ukraine in the 18th century, would have made Boris's comment. Would she have described herself as somebody who suffers from toxic masculinity, but is in feminist denial? And the whole idea that somehow this war is this kind of is a result of a psychological sort of problem of a particular individual, and is reduced to one single individual, overlooks the fact that the war in the Ukraine was a long time in the making. And the war in the Ukraine didn't just begin this year, nor did it begin in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. The Russian question and the difficulty that Russia has in being an integral part of the world has got a longer history that essentially goes back to the First World War. So I think it's important for us to realize that what we have seen played out on the battlefields of Ukraine is a result of a chain of events that began with the displacement and the disorganization of Europe after the First World War, which led to what's historians call the German question, where Germany's place in Europe became so unraveled and confused. Germany was both too big to be just a simple nation, but it was also too small to be a dominant power within Europe. Hence, its decision to start the Second World War. But the German question, which was there for a very long time, was only resolved after the unification of Germany in the post-Cold War era, actually led to something else, a different problem, which is the Russian question, whereby Russia itself is now in an analogous position where it is both too big to be a small regional power, but it's also too small to be the superpower that it once was. And its position, as a result of the Cold War, is one that has essentially confusing and is going to lead to conflict, not just simply within the European context, but also in the Caucasians and within Asia itself. That's given in all of this. Now, this sensibility of historical amnesia that I talked about, this refusal to understand historical continuity and the chain of events that have led to the current situation, is something that has become imbued with the character of a religion. And I don't know how many of you have done university courses in the social sciences, or particularly in politics and sociology or international relations. But if you had, you would have heard that, for example, we live in a world where the nation state is no longer important. That the nation state no longer matters because the world's become so globalized that the problems are global. And of course, as many of you will know, in the recent pandemic, we discovered that the nation states did matter. Because if you were going to get vaccinations, you weren't going to get it from God. You weren't going to get it from an international organization. It wasn't the World Health Organization that provided people in England with vaccinations, or people in France or in Germany, but it was through the efforts of the nation state and national governments. And of course, some people say that the nation state doesn't matter, but they're also saying is that democracy doesn't matter. Because if the nation state doesn't matter, what's the point of voting? What's the point of electing governments? What's the point of exercising our freedom? We might as well hand everything over to the European Court of Human Rights or some international body to make these kinds of decisions for ourselves. So there's a profound anti-freedom, anti-democratic impulse that lies behind the whole project of the presentism and the cosmopolitan sensibility that goes along with it. You will have heard, for example, that national sovereignty is just simply a populist prejudice, that only simpletons like myself and others who actually believe in the people can imagine that national sovereignty matters. Because it's impossible for national sovereignty to work. You always hear people say the world is so complex. It's even more complex than it was 20 years ago. We live in a world of rapid change where what is true today becomes false next month. And of course, if you have that kind of anti-historical logic where you basically decry all of these institutions and basically indicate that the past is gone, we leave the past behind, then what you also follows is all the lessons from the past are proven to be irrelevant, and all the truths, and all the wisdom, and all the intellectual legacy that people struggle to create over the centuries are really of archaeological significance. They no longer have a role to play in influencing our day-to-day life in the current era. And that sensibility of cutting ourselves from the past has also led to what is very important in relation to the conflict in the Ukraine, the loss of a geopolitical imagination. Geopolitics has increasingly become a dirty word. National interests have also become a dirty word. Obviously, somebody doesn't agree with me there. And in that kind of situation, what we have is a kind of reluctance to understand that whether we like it or not, the wars that we see around us are not somehow exceptional, not somehow one-off unique events that are going to end sometimes very soon, but they are really part of a pattern of our existence. And that's something you have to learn to live with. That national security, which sounds dirty, national security and defending a way of life, which is something that other people do elsewhere, is not something that you can take for granted. It isn't just something that's a problem for Ukrainians, it's a problem for everybody. And that kind of understanding of our world, that geopolitical understanding of our world, is something that we're going to make people aware, not because we are particularly interested in fighting wars, not because we don't love peace, but because we understand that whether we like it or not, conflict within humanity is not something that we can leave behind anytime soon. Now, historical amnesia did not emerge spontaneously. It wasn't something that emerged as a product of nature. It is, in many respects, the direct outcome of what today we call the cultural wars. Because if you look at the way that the cultural wars began, and what we call cancel culture today began, it didn't really begin 2 years ago, or 5 years ago, even 10 years ago. You can see its early traces already in the interwar period, in the 1920s and in the 1930s. And one of the most important manifestations of the culture war has always been an obsession, an almost ideological obsession, to basically leave the past behind, to pathologize the past, to indict the past, to see everything that has gone on beforehand as somehow alien to our existence. And that kind of sensibility of breaking, of rupturing historical continuity and distancing society is really very important, because what it does is it basically says that the cultural values that came from the past are morally inferior to the ones that we invent today. And all the debates we have, whether it's in universities or in cultural institutions or in the cinema, all these debates that we have is essentially between whether the values of the past are worthy of significance, or whether they're irrelevant. Today, I was listening to the Today program. I do this as a masochistic intellectual, because every time I listen to the Today program, I always say to myself, either they're crazy or I'm crazy. And one of the phrases that was used, and it's a very interesting phrase that we take for granted, we never question it, is one of the guys was saying, keeping up with the times. We've got to keep up with the times. And the implication of the idea of keeping up with the times is that big forms of behavior and ideals and attitudes that weren't born today are somehow inferior to the ones that a bunch of academics or a bunch of cultural entrepreneurs have innovated today. And that kind of arrogance and kind of assumption of moral superiority that assumes that we are more enlightened than our parents or our great parents is so deeply inbred that just about everybody you talk to imagines that that they are far more enlightened, they are more aware than their mom and dad or their grandmother and their grandparents. That somehow these people just really were not aware of all the incredible insights that we are aware of now. Of course, obviously, we do discover new things, and we learn new facts, and we learn to behave differently. But those aspects of our lives are built upon what has gone on beforehand. We don't become more sensitive by desensitizing ourselves to what has gone on beforehand. So forgetting to think historically, I think, is really quite important. And one of the things that I argue about in the book that I'm published in September is the principal consequence of historical amnesia has been the moral disarmament of the West, where all the important values and virtues that are important in a civilized society are increasingly decried, where even values like courage, like duty, like service, are regarded as something that is quaint, and you expect people in the royal family to occasionally mouth them, but in the real world, these things are not particularly important. And we continually diminish the status of civic virtues, of solidarity, all the virtues that kind of binds us together, and we assume that in so doing, we are somehow moving forward and progressing in a positive direction. I think that what this does is it puts freedom into a precarious position. The reason why it puts freedom in a precarious position is because it fails to understand, it fails to grasp how freedom works. People who don't take freedom of speech, for example, sorry about this. Freedom today cannot be taken for granted. And that was shown, I think Alistair, somebody else mentioned just now, this report that was published last week. It said that 61% of students felt that unlimited free speech was a bad thing. And only 17% of students supported what they call unlimited free speech on campuses. Now, that kind of attitude, I'm not a big believer in surveys, but we all know that in a sense, the freedom of expression is continually undermined by an impulse to censor ourselves. The number of times I come across people who say to me, there's little point in opening myself up and creating a lot of hassle. Of course, people who don't take the freedom of speech seriously are unlikely to understand the issue that's stake in the Ukraine. Because what would happen if 67% of Ukrainian people said that the freedom of our nation is not simply an absolute right. It's not something that I'm willing to fight for. You know, if you look at the research that's been carried out, a significant proportion of people in European countries Western European countries, in places like Holland, for example, a majority actually argue that they would never fight in a war against a foreign nation. In other words, they will never do what the Ukrainians are doing, because for some reason or another they imagine that is not all that important. And of course there's a connection here, because if you don't take the freedom of speech seriously, it's not something you really value that much. You value being comfortable, you value sort of not being hassled by debate and argument. Then of course it's not surprising that you value your life to the point at which the idea of making a sacrifice, the idea of duty of supporting your nation in a war against an invader is something that is alien to your very existence. In her essay, What is Freedom?, the political philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote of the miracle of freedom's rare appearance. I love that expression, the miracle of freedom's rare appearance. And what she's really talking about when she talks about freedom as a miracle is that when you look at the sweep of history, the thousands of years that we've been through, freedom is a very rare accomplishment. It's a very rare flower. And when we do come across this miracle, when freedom appears, then we have a duty, an important duty, to fight for it. So basically what I'm suggesting in my discussion on history is that historical amnesia should serve us as a warning against our inclination to take our freedoms for granted. I want to end on a very different point, because I think it's a way of connecting the historical problems to the present day discussions. One of the achievements of the struggle for freedom was tolerance. And tolerance, which we kind of no longer understand, because tolerance today means just being nice. Tolerance was basically about the willingness to allow people to live in accordance with their own thoughts. It was very much about allowing people to live with their conscience. And it represented, certainly since the Protestant Reformation, an important insight whereby we understand that you do not have the right to force me to think in a way that's different than the way I think. Which means, for example, you don't have the right to send me to a university workshop so that I will come to, basically come to terms with my white privilege, or come to terms with my masculine superiority, or come to terms with whatever. You don't have the right to change the way that I think, because I've got the right to live in accordance with my conscience. So it was something that tolerance was very much about. And today what I find very distressing is that both sides of the debate, for example on abortion, actually deny conscience. So for example, those people who believe in the woman's right to choose, and I'm a big believer in women's right to choose, very often deny religious doctors, the Catholic doctors, the right to say no and not provide an abortion because they think it is against their conscience to do so. In other words, what they're saying is that if you're a doctor, whether you like it or not, even if it's against your conscience, even if it goes against what you think is right, morally right, you still have to provide that operation. And I think that's wrong. That is something that's totally wrong. And similarly, in today's climate, you have a very powerful movement towards criminalizing or pathologizing abortion, to the point at which you do not allow a person, a woman, to act in accordance with her conscience. You do not allow a woman to exercise her autonomy and to act in accordance with her inclination, because you feel that somehow or another her behavior should become subject to force external itself. So on the one hand you have the invasion of private life, of conscience, from what's called the left, but you also have the invasion of private life and conscience from what is derived. And I think that is really a very major problem, because it tells us that both sides of this culture war that we fight have a very selective and a very utilitarian and pragmatic orientation about the freedom of conscience. They don't believe in it, actually. They don't think that the freedom of conscience is something that is good in and of itself. They think that freedom of conscience is really good if it's their conscience and their freedom, but not so good when it's other people's, and vice versa. And I think that the reason why we live in a world where the valuation of conscience has declined so much, and why in general freedom has become so empty of its moral content, is ultimately to do with the moral disarmament of Western culture. And I think that our job, if we take our freedom seriously, is to do whatever we can to make sure that we morally rearm and we create a world where these accomplishments from the past, as well as our own contribution to it, creates a much more freedom-loving world, rather than one that totally and continually hides behind empty rhetoric. Thank you.